I must live without regrets, she stated, ditching our wedding plans for a spiritual journey with her ex. I gave the ring to a needy couple. She is now back, forsaken and expecting a baby, inquiring if I could step in and be the child's true father. Some people say marriage changes everything, but I never expected it to change this fast. 3 days after Victoria and I exchanged vows at the courthouse, I was sitting at my laptop finalizing our honeymoon cruise to the Caribbean when she walked into our living room with that distant look I'd started recognizing but hadn't understood yet. "Ben, we need to talk," she said, settling onto the couch with her legs tucked under her in that way that usually meant she was about to share something she'd been thinking about for weeks. I saved the cruise confirmation and turned to face her, expecting maybe some last-minute packing concerns or excitement about snorkeling in Cozumel. Instead, she took a deep breath and delivered words that would completely rewrite our future. "I can't go on the honeymoon," she announced, her voice steady but her eyes avoiding mine. "I need to live without regrets, and there's something I have to do first." I stared at her, processing the impossibility of what she'd just said. We'd been married for exactly 72 hours. And she was canceling our honeymoon. "What kind of something?" I asked, though part of me already sensed this wasn't about rescheduling flights or extending our trip. "I'm leaving tomorrow morning for a meditation retreat in Oregon," she continued, finally meeting my eyes with a resolve that felt foreign and final. "It's a spiritual awakening intensive with Lucas." Lucas? Her college boyfriend from 7 years ago, the guy who'd introduced her to meditation and yoga before disappearing to find himself in various ashrams across the country. The same Lucas who'd been sending her increasingly frequent texts about consciousness expansion and authentic living over the past few months. "Lucas who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer and felt something cold settling in my stomach. "You know which Lucas? He's been studying with this incredible teacher in the Cascade Mountains, and there's an opening in their program. This could be my chance to discover who I really am before I can truly commit to anyone else." The irony wasn't lost on me that she was talking about discovering herself after we'd literally just committed to each other in front of a judge and our families. "Victoria, we just got married 3 days ago. We promised to build a life together." She nodded like she was acknowledging a minor scheduling conflict rather than the complete abandonment of our marriage. "I know the timing seems strange, but that's exactly why this is so important. I realize now that I've been sleepwalking through life, making decisions based on what other people expected rather than what my soul actually needs." Her soul needed to run off with her ex-boyfriend apparently. "So what about us? What about everything we planned?" "This isn't about us ending," she said, reaching for my hand in a gesture that felt more like pity than affection. "This is about me becoming the person you deserve to be married to. I need to explore this connection with Lucas and understand what it means for my spiritual growth." I pulled my hand away, the full scope of her betrayal crystallizing in my mind. "You're leaving me for your ex-boyfriend and calling it spiritual growth. It's not that simple, Ben. Lucas and I have this incredible soul connection that I never fully explored. The retreat leader says that unresolved romantic energy can block authentic spiritual development." I almost laughed at the elaborate rationalization she'd constructed to justify what amounted to abandoning our marriage for another man. "How long is this retreat?" "Probably 6 months, maybe longer if I really connect with the teachings. The important thing is that I follow where the journey leads me without artificial timelines or limitations. 6 months minimum, with no defined end date, to explore her soul connection with another man while I waited at home like some kind of spiritual backup plan. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where normal married couples were probably doing normal married couple things instead of planning their post-wedding abandonment strategies. "I can't believe you're serious about this," I said, turning back to face her. "Ben, you have to understand that this is bigger than just us. This is about becoming my authentic self, breaking free from societal conditioning, and honoring my deepest truth." Her deepest truth apparently involved dishonoring the vows she'd made 3 days earlier, but I didn't bother pointing out that particular contradiction. "And you couldn't figure this out before we got married?" I thought I was ready, but the wedding made me realize how much I've been suppressing my real desires to fit into conventional expectations. Lucas helped me see that marriage itself might be a patriarchal construct that limits feminine expression. Lucas had certainly been busy during their recent phone conversations, filling her head with whatever pseudo-spiritual nonsense justified breaking apart someone else's marriage. I felt something shift inside me then, a clarity that cut through the shock and disappointment. This woman who was sitting in our living room explaining why she needed to abandon our marriage for spiritual enlightenment with her ex-boyfriend wasn't someone I recognized anymore, and maybe that was the point. Victoria spent that evening packing her meditation books, crystal collection, and flowing bohemian dresses while I sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and watching our marriage dissolve in real time. She moved through our bedroom like she was preparing for summer camp rather than abandoning her husband, carefully folding her yoga pants and selecting which sage bundles would best support her spiritual journey. "I'm leaving the practical stuff," she announced, gesturing toward her winter coats and professional clothes hanging in the closet. "I won't need those where I'm going." She left behind everything that represented responsibility or commitment, taking only items that fit her new narrative about authentic living and cosmic consciousness. The next morning, I watched from our front window as Lucas pulled up in a dented Volkswagen van covered with bumper stickers about meditation retreats and conscious living, his long hair tied back in a way that probably looked spiritually enlightened to Victoria but struck me as deliberately calculated. She kissed my cheek goodbye like she was leaving for a business trip, promised to stay in touch about our journey, and climbed into the van without looking back. I stood in our suddenly quiet townhouse, surrounded by the remnants of a marriage that had lasted exactly 4 days, and realized I had two choices: collapse into self-pity or rebuild my life completely. I chose reconstruction. That afternoon, I began systematically removing every trace of Victoria from our shared space, a process that felt less like erasing memories and more like archaeological excavation of who I'd been before I started accommodating someone else's ever-changing spiritual needs. Her remaining clothes went to Goodwill, her abandoned books to the local library, her kitchen gadgets to neighbors who actually appreciated practical gifts. I kept one item, the handwritten letter she'd left on our nightstand, filled with rambling explanations about soul contracts and authentic expression, which I filed away as evidence of her complete disconnect from reality. The engagement ring presented a different challenge entirely. Victoria had left it on the bathroom counter with a note saying she couldn't carry that energy into her new phase of existence, apparently forgetting that the ring represented 8 months of my savings and careful planning. I'd bought the $4,500 princess cut solitaire after researching diamond grades and consulting with 3 different jewelers, wanting something that would honor both her taste and the significance of our commitment. Now it sat in its velvet box like a monument to my own naivety about her character. Rather than keeping it as some kind of bitter souvenir, I took the ring to a reputable jewelry store downtown where the appraiser offered me $2,800 for the piece, explaining the difference between retail and resale value with the kind of gentle expertise that suggested he'd handled similar situations before. I accepted his offer without negotiation, pocketed the cash, and drove directly to the homeless shelter on the east side of town where I'd volunteered during college. The shelter coordinator, a practical woman named Ruth who'd been helping displaced families for over 20 years, listened to my unusual request with the kind of calm professionalism that made me grateful for people who actually solved problems instead of creating them. "We have a young couple with a newborn who've been living in their car for 3 weeks. She said, leading me to the parking lot where a rusted Honda Civic sat under the bare February trees. James lost his construction job when his back injury kept him out of work, and Sandra just had the baby 6 weeks ago. They're trying to save enough for a security deposit, but it's almost impossible when you're paying for gas and baby formula." I knocked on the driver's side window and introduced myself to James and Sandra, a couple probably 5 years younger than me who looked exhausted in the way that comes from trying to maintain dignity while everything falls apart around you. Their daughter, barely 2 months old, was sleeping in a car seat they'd wedged between pillows and blankets in the back seat. "I'd like to give you something," I said, handing James the envelope containing the ring money along with a list of local housing assistance programs I'd quickly researched on my phone. "It's not a loan or charity. It's just money that needs to go to someone who'll use it for something important." Sandra started crying immediately, not the manipulative tears I'd grown accustomed to from Victoria, but the genuine, overwhelmed relief of someone who'd been carrying impossible weight for too long. James stared at the cash like he couldn't quite believe it was real, then looked up at me with the kind of gratitude that made my throat tight. "Why would you do this for strangers?" he asked. "Because turning pain into purpose feels better than just sitting with the pain," I said, surprising myself with how true that felt. They wrote me a thank you letter 2 weeks later, sent to my office address, explaining that the money had covered their security deposit and first month's rent on a small apartment near Sandra's new job at a medical clinic. They included a photo of their daughter in her new nursery, a tiny room they'd painted yellow and filled with secondhand furniture that looked like paradise compared to the back seat of a Honda. I kept that letter in my desk drawer as a reminder that Victoria's abandonment had created something genuinely good in the world, even if that hadn't been her intention. 6 weeks after Victoria disappeared into her spiritual awakening journey, I used our honeymoon fund to move out of the townhouse we'd shared and into a converted warehouse loft in the Arts District downtown. The space was raw and industrial, with exposed brick walls, concrete floors, and massive windows that flooded the main room with natural light during the day. Most people would have seen it as a fixer-upper project, but I saw it as a blank canvas for rebuilding my life according to my own specifications rather than someone else's constantly shifting spiritual requirements. The loft came with a detached garage that the previous tenant had used for pottery, but I had different plans for that space. I'd always been fascinated by motorcycles, drawn to the precision engineering and the way every component had to work perfectly with every other component to create something both beautiful and functional. During my marriage, Victoria had dismissed my interest in motorcycles as toxic masculinity and compensatory behavior, so I'd abandoned the idea of ever owning one. Now, with no one to accommodate or apologize to, I bought a 1975 Honda CB750 that hadn't run in 15 years and had it delivered to my new garage. The bike was a disaster when it arrived, covered in rust and missing half its original parts, but that was exactly what I wanted. I needed a project that would require months of patient, methodical work, something that would absorb all the mental energy I'd previously wasted trying to understand Victoria's emotional gymnastics. I set up a workbench, bought a comprehensive set of tools, and enrolled in online mechanical engineering courses that I studied every evening after work. YouTube became my technical college, teaching me everything from engine rebuilding to electrical system diagnostics, and I discovered that I had an intuitive understanding of how mechanical systems functioned that I'd never had the opportunity to develop. My neighbor Oscar, a 73-year-old retired machinist who lived in the loft next door, noticed me struggling with the bike's carburetor one Saturday morning and wandered over to offer advice. "You're overthinking it, son," he said, watching me fumble with tiny jets and float bowls that seemed designed to frustrate anyone without decades of experience. Carburetors are simple machines. They just mix air and fuel in the right proportions. Stop making it complicated. Oscar became my unofficial mentor, teaching me that precision and patience create lasting value, while shortcuts and emotional decisions inevitably lead to problems that require expensive fixes later. His workshop was a museum of perfectly maintained vintage tools and machinery, each piece cared for with the kind of attention that comes from understanding that quality equipment outlasts the people who use it. "A good mechanic doesn't just fix things," he told me while showing me how to properly gap spark plugs. "A good mechanic understands why things break and prevents problems before they happen." Under Oscar's guidance, I spent 4 months completely rebuilding the Honda's engine, learning to machine new parts when originals weren't available and developing the kind of focused concentration that comes from work that demands absolute attention to detail. When the bike finally started for the first time, producing a deep, satisfying rumble that reverberated through the garage, I felt a pride that was entirely different from any professional accomplishment I'd experienced. This was something I'd created with my own hands, knowledge I'd earned through persistent effort, a machine that existed because I'd refused to give up when every logical instinct suggested the project was hopeless. The restored Honda led to a second bike, then a third, as word spread through the local motorcycle community that someone in the Arts District was doing quality restoration work for reasonable prices. I discovered that collectors and enthusiasts were willing to pay substantial money for motorcycles that had been rebuilt with proper attention to original specifications and mechanical excellence. Within 6 months, I had enough restoration projects to justify quitting my day job and focusing entirely on building custom motorcycles that reflected both historical accuracy and modern performance improvements. The business grew organically through referrals and reputation rather than marketing or social media promotion, attracting clients who valued craftsmanship over flashy appearances. I also adopted a German Shepherd named Rex from the local animal shelter, a 3-year-old dog whose previous owner had surrendered him for being too energetic. Rex turned out to be the perfect workshop companion, content to lie on a blanket near my workbench for hours while I rebuilt engines, alert enough to bark when customers arrived, and loyal in the uncomplicated way that only dogs manage. Walking Rex through the neighborhood every morning and evening introduced me to other dog owners, creating a casual social network of people who shared practical concerns about veterinary care and training rather than abstract theories about consciousness expansion and authentic living. My life had developed a rhythm that felt both productive and sustainable, built around work that challenged me intellectually while producing tangible results I could see and touch and ride. For 2 full years, I maintained complete no contact with Victoria, blocking her on all social media platforms and declining updates from mutual acquaintances who occasionally tried to share news about her spiritual journey. I'd learned that curiosity about an ex's life was just another form of self-inflicted torture, and I had better ways to spend my mental energy than wondering whether Victoria had achieved the enlightenment she'd abandoned our marriage to pursue. My motorcycle restoration business had evolved from a garage hobby into a respected custom shop with a 6-month waiting list for my hand-built creations. Collectors from across the country shipped vintage bikes to my workshop, trusting me to rebuild engines that hadn't run in decades and restore paint schemes to factory specifications. I developed a reputation for attention to detail that bordered on obsessive, the kind of perfectionism that made clients willing to pay premium prices for work they couldn't get anywhere else. The local technical college approached me about teaching motorcycle mechanics courses in their continuing education program, recognizing that my combination of practical experience and engineering knowledge could help train the next generation of skilled technicians. I discovered that I had a natural talent for breaking down complex mechanical concepts into understandable steps, helping students develop both the technical skills and the patient mindset that quality restoration work required. Most people want to rush to the fun parts, I told my Tuesday evening class while demonstrating proper valve adjustment technique. They want to hear the engine run without doing the boring work of measuring clearances and checking specifications. But the boring work is what makes the difference between a motorcycle that runs and a motorcycle that runs reliably for 20 years. Teaching forced me to articulate knowledge I'd developed through trial and error, transforming my personal experience into systematic instruction that helped other people avoid the mistakes I'd made during my early restoration attempts. My students ranged from college kids interested in automotive careers to retirees looking for meaningful hobbies, and I found genuine satisfaction in watching them develop confidence with tools and techniques that had once seemed impossibly complex to me. The business success allowed me to upgrade my workshop equipment and expand into custom fabrication work, building one-off motorcycles that combined vintage aesthetics with modern performance improvements. I'd mastered the art of creating parts that looked historically accurate but incorporated contemporary materials and engineering advances, producing bikes that satisfied both collectors and riders who actually wanted to use their machines regularly. My confidence had flourished in ways that had nothing to do with external validation or relationship status, built instead on the solid foundation of proven competence in work that mattered to me. I'd created something valuable through my own effort and dedication, surrounded by a community of people who shared my appreciation for craftsmanship and mechanical excellence. Rex had become locally famous among the motorcycle enthusiasts who visited my shop, a perfectly trained workshop dog who could differentiate between customers and delivery drivers, alerting me to visitors while remaining calm around the power tools and machinery that filled our workspace. Dog owners in the neighborhood had started organizing informal meetups in the park across from my loft, creating a social network based on the shared experience of responsible pet ownership rather than abstract philosophical discussions about authentic living and consciousness expansion. The first crack in my carefully maintained no-contact policy came through anonymous emails that began arriving at my business address around the 18-month mark, messages from untraceable accounts with subject lines like, "Important message," and, "Please read this." I deleted the first few without opening them, recognizing Victoria's writing style in the preview text that appeared in my inbox. But the emails kept coming with increasing frequency, eventually forcing me to create an automatic filter that sent anything containing her characteristic phrases about spiritual growth and authentic connection directly to my spam folder. The harassment escalated when Victoria's brother Nathan called my business phone on a busy Thursday afternoon, interrupting a consultation with a client who was considering a complete restoration of his father's 1968 Triumph Bonneville. "Ben, I know you probably don't want to hear from any of us, but I need to tell you what's happening with Victoria," Nathan said, his voice carrying the exhausted tone of someone who'd been dealing with crisis management for months. "She's been drifting between different spiritual communities, and honestly, she's not doing well mentally or financially." I excused myself from the client meeting and took the call in my office, closing the door while Rex settled at my feet with the patient resignation of a dog who'd learned to wait out phone conversations that clearly stressed his owner. "Nathan, I appreciate you calling, but Victoria made her choice 2 years ago. Whatever's happening with her now isn't my responsibility." "I get that, and I'm not asking you to fix anything," he said quickly. "But she's been writing these emails to you, and our parents are worried that she's becoming obsessed with the idea that you two are meant to be together. She keeps talking about cosmic signs and spiritual tests, claiming that your silence proves you're her twin flame or something equally ridiculous." The twin flame concept was new to Victoria's spiritual vocabulary, but it fit perfectly with her pattern of adopting whatever mystical framework best supported her current emotional needs. "She needs professional help, not cosmic validation," I said. "We've tried suggesting therapy, but she insists that traditional psychology can't address soul-level trauma and karmic debt. She's been living in these intentional communities where everyone enables each other's delusions instead of encouraging actual personal growth." 3 weeks later, Victoria's father appeared at my motorcycle shop during the lunch hour, looking older and more defeated than I remembered from our wedding day. Robert had always struck me as a practical man who worked in construction and preferred straightforward solutions to complex problems, but now he seemed overwhelmed by a situation that defied logical approaches. "Ben, I'm sorry to bother you at work, but I didn't know where else to turn," he said, examining the partially restored Kawasaki I was rebuilding for a collector in Denver. "Victoria's been scammed by these spiritual teachers she's been following. They've taken thousands of dollars from her for workshops and retreats that promise enlightenment but just leave her more confused and dependent." I set down my torque wrench and gave him my full attention, recognizing the genuine distress of a father watching his daughter self-destruct in ways he couldn't understand or prevent. "How much money are we talking about?" "Everything she had saved, plus money she borrowed from her mother and some credit card debt that's gotten completely out of control. She's living in her car again, moving between different communities when they kick her out for not paying her share of expenses." The irony wasn't lost on me that Victoria, who'd left me to pursue authentic living and spiritual freedom, had ended up in exactly the kind of financial and emotional instability she'd claimed to despise about conventional relationships. "I'm not going to get involved in her financial problems, Robert. That ship sailed when she decided I wasn't spiritual enough for her journey." "I understand, and I'm not asking for money," he said, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "I'm asking if there's any way you could just talk to her, maybe help her understand that these people she's following are taking advantage of her vulnerability. She won't listen to family, but she might listen to you." I'd already filed divorce papers 18 months earlier through my attorney, a straightforward process since Victoria had never contested the dissolution and had no interest in claiming any assets from our brief marriage. The legal side of our relationship had been resolved efficiently, but apparently the emotional side was still creating problems for people I genuinely cared about. Robert, talking to Victoria would only encourage whatever fantasy she's constructed about us getting back together. The kindest thing I can do is maintain boundaries and let her figure out her own life." He nodded sadly, understanding my position even though it wasn't the answer he'd hoped for. I watched him leave through my workshop window, a decent man dealing with consequences that had nothing to do with choices he'd made, and I documented the conversation in the file my attorney had suggested I maintain for exactly this type of situation. Victoria appeared at my loft on a snowy December evening 2 years and 8 months after she'd left for her spiritual journey, standing at my door like a ghost from a life I'd almost forgotten. I'd been working late in my workshop, installing a custom exhaust system on a 1973 Norton Commando, when Rexa's sharp bark alerted me to someone approaching the building. Through the security monitor I'd installed after her family's visits, I saw a heavily pregnant woman in an oversized coat, her face gaunt and her hair hanging in unwashed strings around her shoulders. It took me several seconds to recognize Victoria, and when I did, the shock was followed immediately by a cold calculation about how to handle this situation without creating legal problems for myself. I opened the door with the security chain still attached, keeping Rex beside me as a physical barrier and witness to whatever was about to unfold. "Hello, Ben," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I'm probably the last person you expected to see, but I really need to talk to you." She was obviously pregnant, probably 6 or 7 months along, carrying a worn backpack that appeared to contain everything she owned. Her eyes darted past me into the loft, taking in the industrial furniture and motorcycle posters that had replaced our old domestic arrangements, clearly shocked by how completely I'd rebuilt my life without any consideration for her eventual return. "Victoria, what are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral and professional. "Lucas and I aren't together anymore," she said, as if that information should matter to me. "Actually, we never really were together in the way I thought we were. It was more like a tantric spiritual partnership that got complicated when I became pregnant." The clinical way she described her relationship with the man she'd abandoned our marriage for suggested that whatever enlightenment she'd been seeking had translated into an impressive capacity for emotional detachment when it served her purposes. "Congratulations on your pregnancy," I said. "But I'm not sure why you're telling me this." "Because I made a terrible mistake, Ben. Everything I thought I wanted, everything I thought I needed to discover about myself, it was all just fantasy and manipulation. Lucas took the donations people gave us for our meditation center and disappeared the day I told him I was pregnant. Left me stranded at this commune in Oregon with no money and no way to get home." I listened to her explanation with the same detached interest I'd developed for evaluating motorcycle restoration projects that had been mismanaged by previous owners. "I'm sorry that happened to you. That sounds like a difficult situation." "Difficult doesn't begin to cover it. I've been living in shelters and on friends' couches for the past 4 months, trying to figure out how to take care of myself and this baby. My parents won't help because they're still angry about how I treated you, and I don't have anywhere else to turn." She was building toward the real purpose of her visit, and I already knew what she was going to ask. "Ben, I know I have no right to ask this after what I did, but I need you to consider taking me back. Taking us back. This baby needs a father, and you're the only man I've ever known who would actually be a good parent." The audacity of the request was breathtaking, even by Victoria's standards. She wanted me to rescue her from the consequences of abandoning our marriage, raise another man's child, and pretend that her 2-year spiritual adventure had been some kind of meaningful journey rather than an extended exercise in selfishness and poor judgment. "Victoria, we're divorced. Have been for over a year. You made your choice when you left with Lucas." "But that's exactly what I'm trying to tell you. I didn't choose Lucas over you. I chose the idea of freedom and adventure over the reality of commitment and responsibility. Now I understand the difference. You understand that Lucas won't support you and your child, so you've come back to the backup plan you rejected 2 years ago." She flinched at my words, probably expecting more emotional engagement or at least some acknowledgement of our shared history. "It's not like that. Being with Lucas taught me how much I took you for granted. You were everything real and stable in my life, and I threw it away because I was immature and listened to people who filled my head with nonsense about authentic living." I walked to my desk and retrieved the thank you letter from James and Sandra, the couple who'd used Victoria's ring money to secure housing for their newborn daughter. "This is from the homeless couple I gave your engagement ring money to," I said, handing her the letter. "They used it to get an apartment and start over. Your ring helped someone who actually needed it instead of just wanting it." She read the letter with growing confusion and what looked like genuine shock. "You sold my ring? You left it on the bathroom counter with a note about not being able to carry that energy into your new phase of existence. I turned it into something useful for people who were actually struggling instead of just seeking enlightenment. I can't believe you gave away something that represented our love to complete strangers. It didn't represent our love, Victoria. It represented my savings and your willingness to accept expensive gifts from someone you planned to abandon. These people needed help. You needed spiritual adventure. Different priorities. She started crying then, the desperate tears of someone who'd finally realized that actions have permanent consequences and that some bridges can't be rebuilt after you've burned them completely. Ben, please. I know I hurt you, and I know I don't deserve another chance, but this baby needs stability. You're the most responsible man I've ever known. You'd be an amazing father. I probably would be a good father, I agreed. To my own children, with someone who actually wants to be married to me instead of treating me like a financial safety net for cleaning up mistakes. When she refused to leave after I explained that our conversation was over, I called building security and documented the entire incident for my attorney, adding another page to the file that demonstrated a clear pattern of harassment and boundary violations that might eventually require legal intervention. After documenting the incident with both building security and my attorney for a restraining order if Victoria continued showing up uninvited, I returned to my workshop where Rex was waiting patiently beside the vintage Harley-Davidson I was rebuilding for a collector in California. The familiar weight of tools in my hands and the methodical process of adjusting carburetor settings helped restore the calm focus that Victoria's unexpected appearance had disrupted, reminding me that I'd built something genuinely valuable that existed independently of her chaos and poor decisions. The next morning, I planned a motorcycle road trip through the Pacific Northwest with Rex riding in the custom sidecar I'd fabricated specifically for our adventures together, excited about visiting potential suppliers and motorcycle museums while exploring mountain roads that would test both my riding skills and the reliability of the bikes I'd restored. My life had become exactly what I had deliberately constructed over the past 3 years. Purposeful work that challenged me intellectually, financial independence built through my own skills and reputation, and a daily routine aligned with my values rather than someone else's constantly shifting spiritual requirements. Surrounded by loyal companionship that appreciated consistency and reliability over dramatic emotional performances.